When the Letters Arrived Too Late is a story about two souls who spent their lives writing to each other but never truly reading what was written. Amelia Gray, a quiet literature teacher in a coastal town, once loved a man who promised to return before winter. His name was Ethan Hale, a photographer chasing forgotten lighthouses around the world. They wrote endlessly, letters full of metaphors, promises, and unspoken fears, until silence replaced ink. Years later, when a sealed box of those letters finally reaches Amelia, her world trembles between past and present, between what was and what might have been. As Amelia reads, we are taken through their memories. Summer days on the pier, rain-soaked confessions, arguments written on napkins, and the one letter that never arrived, the one that could have changed everything. Each letter becomes a key, unlocking truths about forgiveness, time, and how love survives even when everything else fades. The story shifts between Amelia's present and Ethan's journey years earlier, revealing the fragile thread that always connected them. When their timelines finally collide, it's not through reunion, but revelation. Ethan's last photograph, hidden among the letters, shows the lighthouse where she still walks alone. Proof that he came back, only too late. When the Letters Arrived Too Late isn't about lost love. It's about love delayed, love tested by silence, and the courage to forgive the one who never stopped writing, even when the world stopped waiting. Through the rhythm of pen and paper, the story explores the bittersweet truth that sometimes love doesn't need to be returned. It only needs to be remembered. The morning smelled of sea salt and paper dust. Amelia Gray stood in front of the post office counter, the same place she had visited every week for 20 years, though she hadn't received a letter in almost as long. The clerk, a young man with uncertain eyes, carried a small box sealed in brown tape. Her name was written in ink, faded yet painfully familiar. To Miss Amelia Gray, in case I never make it home. Ethan Hale, 2010. Her breath caught. She traced the letters with her trembling fingers as if by touching the handwriting she could reach across time. The clerk said something polite, maybe an apology, maybe a formality, but Amelia didn't hear it. She only nodded, holding the box to her chest like something alive. Outside, the sky was soft and gray. The ocean murmured in the distance, and the wind carried the smell of rain. She walked the narrow path back to her small cottage by the cliffs, every step echoing memories she had tried to bury under years of silence. The box waited on her table as she boiled water for tea. She noticed a faint rust stain on the edge of the cardboard. Salt, maybe. The kind of mark left by travel across storms. For a moment, she thought of throwing it away, leaving the past unopened. But then she saw the date again, 2010, the same year Ethan vanished from her life. She cut the tape with an old letter opener. Inside, she found dozens of envelopes bound by a thin blue ribbon. Some were wrinkled and water-damaged, others pristine. Each one bore the same neat handwriting, his handwriting, and at the bottom of the box a small photograph wrapped in tissue paper. It was of her, sitting on the pier, sunlight on her hair, reading a letter that hadn't yet been written. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the chair. The teapot began to whistle behind her, but she didn't move. She held the first envelope between her fingers, afraid to open it, afraid not to. Amelia, if you're reading this, then time has already done what I never could. It brought me back to you. I don't know when you'll find these words, or if I'll still be somewhere you can reach. But I hope, wherever you are, you still look at the sea and think of how it always carried our silence better than our words ever could. E. The page trembled in her hand. For the first time in years, Amelia felt something she thought she had forgotten. The warmth of being remembered. Outside, the rain began to fall. Slow, deliberate drops against the window pane, like someone knocking softly from the other side of time. She looked toward the horizon where the lighthouse stood, barely visible through the mist, the place he had promised to return to. and as thunder rumbled over the sea, she whispered, "You found your way back, Ethan. Just too late." The first time Ethan Hale saw Amelia Gray, she was sitting on the edge of the old pier, a book resting on her knees, her hair tangled by the wind. She was reading out loud, not for anyone in particular, just for the waves that kept her company. Her voice carried the rhythm of the tide, soft and unhurried, like someone who had made peace with solitude. Ethan, a young photographer then, was passing through the small coastal town of Lindsworth to document the dying lighthouses of the region. His camera hung around his neck, the lens still dusty from travel. He didn't mean to stop, but something about the woman on the pier caught him. Maybe the calm, maybe the loneliness that mirrored his own. "Do you always read to the sea?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Amelia looked up, startled, and smiled. That gentle, unsure kind of smile that belonged to people who hadn't yet learned how visible their hearts were. "Only when it listens," she replied. He laughed. "Does it answer?" "Sometimes," she said, "mostly with silence, but it's the kind that doesn't hurt." That was how it began, not with sparks, not with fate, but with curiosity. Over the following days, Ethan kept returning. He brought coffee in paper cups and stories from distant towns, fishermen in Ireland, storms in Lisbon, sunsets in Morocco. Amelia listened with the quiet fascination of someone who had never left home but had dreamed of everywhere. In turn, she taught him stillness. She read him her favorite passages, Wilde, Dickinson, Bronte, and asked what he saw through his camera when he wasn't taking pictures. "I see people trying not to be forgotten," he said once. "Even the sky wants to be remembered." By the end of that summer, the town had learned their rhythm. The photographer and the teacher, always walking the shore together, sometimes talking, sometimes silent. He took a photograph of her every morning, always in the same spot, the pier, the horizon behind her, a letter in her hands. It became a ritual. He would travel, and she would write. She would wait, and he would return, until one day, the waiting stretched longer than either of them expected. When Ethan received the first of Amelia's letters abroad, he was in Iceland, chasing a storm. The envelope was damp and smudged, her words slightly blurred, but he could still read them. "You once said that photographs steal a moment and keep it alive. I think letters do the same. They freeze the heart instead of the face." He carried that letter everywhere, even into places where the sea clawed against the cliffs and the wind tore at his maps. He wrote back, but she would only receive half of them, the rest lost to weather, time, and postal errors that would one day become destiny's cruel hand. Amelia kept teaching, her life folding back into routine, her mailbox becoming her heartbeat. She read his words before bed, answered them with poetry, and kept each reply tied with a blue ribbon in a wooden box under her window. Her colleagues called her patient. Her friends called her foolish, but Amelia simply called it love in transit, something that might arrive late but still arrive. When Ethan came back 2 years later, it was winter. He stood on the same pier, camera in hand, watching the sea in silence. He didn't knock on her door that day. Something held him, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear of finding that time had replaced him. He left town at dawn, leaving a letter behind with the innkeeper. It never reached her. The years after Ethan S.'s first departure unfolded like pages from a long letter, filled with half-finished sentences, unsent words, and the quiet ache of waiting. Every Sunday, Amelia sat by the window of her cottage overlooking the sea, ink-stained fingers resting on fresh paper. She had learned to measure time not by months or seasons, but by envelopes. The postman became a familiar figure, and the soft rustle of paper landing on her doorstep was more thrilling than any heartbeat. Ethan wrote from everywhere: Italy, Greece, the Scottish Isles. His letters were alive with light and loneliness. "Amelia, I saw a lighthouse today that reminded me of you. Tall, patient, and standing exactly where the world breaks apart. There was a bird perched at its top. I swear it looked like it was waiting for something to come back. Maybe I've become that bird." Amelia answered with stories of small joys, her students, her books, the lilac blooming in her yard. But beneath her gentle tone lay a pulse of longing she never confessed aloud. Ethan, the tide was low today, and I found a shell that sounded like the wind in your photographs. I held it to my ear and thought, perhaps this is how you listen to me when you're far away. The letters began to form their own rhythm, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months. They spoke of everything except what mattered most. When are you coming home? Neither dared to ask. As the years passed, their words grew heavier. Ethan's photographs began to appear in galleries. He was becoming the artist he'd always dreamed of. But fame carried silence with it. His letters grew shorter, his handwriting rushed, his tone apologetic. "I'll write more soon. The sea's been rough. I miss you. I promise I do." Amelia pretended not to notice the spaces between his words. She told herself he was busy, that love sometimes spoke through absence. Still, she began writing letters she never sent, the ones where she confessed how much it hurt to wait for someone who was always almost coming home. When winter came, her mailbox was empty for 3 months. She began reading the old letters again, as if time could loop back to the first ones where every word felt like sunlight. Then, one morning, a new envelope arrived. No return address, only her name in his familiar script. The paper was torn at the edges, the ink blurred as if the letter had traveled through rain. "Amelia, I don't know if I'll make it back this time. There are things I've seen that I can't unsee, and I'm not sure the man you loved still exists. But if I don't return, I want you to know this. I kept every letter, every single one. They were the only home I ever had. E." She cried for the first time in years. The sound was soft, almost fragile, like a page turning in the dark. From that day on, she wrote him every night, even without knowing where to send the words. She left them on the windowsill, tied with blue ribbon, whispering his name to the sea. And far away, in another storm-beaten harbor, Ethan did the same, writing her name in notebooks, in margins, in sand, knowing the tide would take it, hoping somehow it would find its way to her. Their love had become a conversation with the ocean. Words cast into waves, answers lost in foam. Neither of them knew that the letters they wrote in those years would one day return, all at once. Together, too late. He never meant to stay away that long. Ethan Hale had promised himself that every trip would be his last before returning home to Amelia. But promises, he learned, could drown quietly without anyone hearing. The photograph that changed everything was taken on a stormy night in Ireland. He had climbed the cliffs to capture the last flash of light from an abandoned lighthouse. The wind tore at his coat. The rain hit the lens like shards of glass. He pressed the shutter once, and lightning split the sky. The image that came out was perfect. The lighthouse leaning against the storm, a single bird frozen in flight. That photograph would later appear on magazine covers, in galleries, in conversations with curators who used words like raw, poetic, and tragic. But all Ethan saw in it was Amelia's handwriting, her letters that spoke of waiting, of storms, of hope that refused to die. That night, on his way down from the cliffs, his car skidded on wet gravel and hit the guardrail. The world went white. He woke up hours later in a small coastal hospital, ribs cracked, hands trembling, camera shattered. They told him he was lucky. He didn't feel lucky. His bag, the one holding months of unsent letters to Amelia, was never found. Somewhere between the cliffs and the tide, her name drifted out into the Atlantic. For weeks, Ethan stayed in a room that smelled of salt and disinfectant. The nurses brought him tea. He stared at the ceiling, tracing words he would never write again. He thought of sending her a telegram, calling her, anything. But shame sat heavy on his chest. How could he tell her that he'd lost everything she had given him? She deserves someone who comes home, he told himself, not someone who keeps getting lost. When he could finally walk again, he took a train south, carrying nothing but his camera and guilt. He photographed small things: hands, windows, birds, but every frame looked like her absence. He wrote one last letter on paper borrowed from the innkeeper. Amelia, I don't know how to explain what distance does to a man. It doesn't erase love, it just turns it into silence. If I ever find a way to return, I'll bring back all the words I lost. Until then, know that I still write your name in the light. E. He left the letter at the harbor post. It was never sent. Years later, that same letter would be found, water damaged, folded into the wrong bag, and returned to Amelia's address with a stack of others. The postmark would read, "Undeliverable." Amelia stopped counting the days when the sea began to change color. The horizon had lost its brightness, and even the waves seemed to move slower, as if they too were tired of waiting. The last letter she received from Ethan came in spring. Short, rushed, full of apologies that said more than they explained. Amelia, I'm still out here. Don't lose faith in me. Some places take longer to leave than others. She had read that line 100 times, wondering what it meant. Longer to leave? Longer to forget? Longer to come home? The following months passed quietly. Her students grew, graduated, moved away. The town changed, new cafes opened by the harbor, the postman retired. Time, it seemed, had moved on, except for her. At night, she still wrote letters. They began to sound different. Not to him, but to the version of herself that still believed in return. If you ever come back, I hope you find me changed. Not by distance, but by patience. The wooden box under her window had grown heavy. She tied each new letter with the same blue ribbon, the same trembling care, as if the act of writing could summon him. But there came a morning when the ribbon ran out, and she couldn't bring herself to buy more. In the absence of words, she started collecting sounds: seashells, wind chimes, the whisper of pages turning. Her home became a museum of things that remembered him in their own quiet ways, and yet something inside her refused to close. One evening, a young couple moved into the neighboring cottage. They laughed often, loudly, without guilt, and for the first time Amelia felt the sharp contrast between what once was and what could have been. The sound of their joy became a mirror. She walked to the pier that night, clutching one of his old letters. The sky was bruised purple, the wind colder than it should have been. She unfolded the page and let the sea take it. Watched as the ink bled into the water, dissolving into nothing. "There," she whispered. "Now we both can let go." But letting go didn't come easy. It stayed like a heartbeat that refused to die, even when the body grew still. Years turned into almost decades. Amelia aged with grace, but not without ghosts. She no longer checked the mailbox, yet she never stopped glancing at it on her way home. Then, one rainy afternoon, 20 years after Ethan E.'s last letter, she received a call from the post office. "Miss Gray, we have a parcel here for you. It appears to have been delayed for quite some time." When she arrived, the clerk brought out the small brown box, the same one from the prologue, faded, fragile, and carrying the scent of salt. Inside were all the letters that had never reached her, dozens of them, some unopened, others marked "Return to Sender." At the bottom, a photograph. Ethan standing before a lighthouse, the one on her own coast, the same she saw from her window every day. On the back, written in blurred ink, "I made it home." Her heart stopped for a moment, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable tenderness of it all. He had returned. She just hadn't been there to see it. That night, Amelia lit every candle in her house. She sat by the window, the letters spread across the table, reading them one by one. Some were love, some were apology, some were silence dressed as poetry. Each one felt like the echo of a heartbeat reaching her from another world. The last envelope was blank. Inside, a single pressed flower, lavender her favorite, and a note. "For every word that never arrived, I left something else behind. Light, Amelia placed the flower in a glass frame and whispered, "You did, Ethan. You always did." The wind moved through the curtains like an exhale. The ocean outside sighed. It was as if the world itself understood what she could not say, that love, even late, was still love. The storm began the same way most endings do, without asking permission. Rain swept the town as if trying to wash it off the map. From her cottage window, Amelia watched the lighthouse blink through the downpour, a pulse in the dark, steady and indifferent. The letters were splayed across her table like a constellation, each one a small and stubborn star. The photograph, Ethan in front of the very lighthouse beyond her window, rested beside a teacup gone cold. She turned the photograph over again. The ink had bled, but the shape of the words was still legible. "I made it home." Her breath quickened. In the bottom of the box she noticed something she had overlooked. A thin receipt, brittle with age, tucked into the seam of the cardboard. She smoothed it flat. Harbor photo and print. 12/19, 2010 1. 6/9 print, matte note, deliver to A. Gray, if not collected by morning. Amelia's hands shook. The date wasn't a metaphor now, it was a timestamp. A woman in her 50s opened the side door, holding a cardigan closed at her throat. "Miss Gray?" she asked, as if speaking an old name summoned an old story. Amelia nodded and held up the receipt. "Did your father run this place?" "He did." The woman glanced at the paper. "He passed a few years ago. We kept some of the old envelopes. People forget to pick things up. We never had the heart to throw them away." She disappeared into the darkness of the shop and returned with a dented tin box that smelled faintly of developer and salt. She set it on the threshold and lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of small envelopes with first names in pencil. The woman sifted, paused, and drew one out with both hands, as if it were delicate glass. A. Gray, December 2010. She extended it. This was marked the storm hold. The roads were closed. He left a note. "If the lady doesn't come by morning, give this to the pier keeper or send it to the school." But the mail was down for days. After that, it must have just sunk into the drawer. Amelia took the envelope as if it might burn. Inside was a single print, the same photograph she had, and a sheet of paper lined from a cafe notebook. "Amelia, I stood at the lighthouse today. I watched the sea take back the hours I owed it. I was a coward. I walked past your street and I didn't knock. I thought you had built a life without me, and I didn't know how to stand inside it like a patient failure. I printed a photograph because it's the only language I ever spoke without stuttering. If the rain lets up, I'll wait until dawn on the third step of the lighthouse stairs. There's a loose board by the handrail. If I can't say it to your face, I'll leave it there. Everything I should have said years ago. If the letters arrive too late, promise me you'll still read them." E. Amelia looked up. The woman at the door was watching her with a kind of hushed pity that people reserve for grief that has ripened. "The lighthouse?" the woman asked softly. Amelia nodded. "Tonight." The woman opened an umbrella and held it out. "Take this, and the path on the east side. The steps are less slippery when it pours." Amelia ran. The wind tore at her coat, flung needles of rain against her cheeks. The cliff stairs were slick with moss, the iron rail cold and faithful beneath her palm. At the lighthouse gate she stopped, chest heaving, and pressed her forehead to the worn wood as if it were a confessional. When she pushed the door, it yielded. The lighthouse keeper had retired years ago. Now the town maintained it on volunteer schedules that weather often overruled. Inside, the spiral staircase curved upward in a dim coil. Water dripped from somewhere above. The air smelled of stone and time. She counted the steps aloud. 1, 2, 3, and knelt on the third. There, just as the note had promised, a thin board along the handrail shifted beneath her fingers. She pried it up. Behind it, wrapped in waxed paper, lay a small bundle, a folded letter and a second photograph. Her vision blurred. She wiped her sleeve across her eyes and opened the letter. Amelia, I lost your letters in a storm, and the man I was in the same place. I kept thinking if I came back empty-handed, I would be a rumor you tell your future to avoid. I am sorry for every month I let shame speak for me. I came home because home was never a roof. It was the way your name looked in my handwriting. Tonight, I walked past your window. I saw a lamp and a book and the shadow of a woman who could forgive me or close the curtain. I didn't knock. There was lightning on the water and a child crying on the street and a train squealing in the distance, and for the first time I understood that time isn't a river, it's a tide. It can pull you under even when you're standing still. If morning finds me brave, I'll come to you. If it finds me gone, know this. I never stopped returning. Every photograph, every road, every empty bed. They were detours on the same path. Toward you. Forgive me if you can. Live if you can't. Ethan. The second photograph was of the pier at dawn, empty and silvered by fog. On the far end, a figure sat with a book on her knees. Amelia turned the print over. On the back, in the hurried, slanted script that had aged alongside her heart, you read to the sea when no one was listening. I listened. The staircase creaked beneath her weight as she sat and cried. Not the careful, silent crying of polite sorrow, but the deep, animal sound that drags the past up by its roots. The storm thinned. The sea hammered the rocks like 1,000 tiny fists. And somewhere in the pulse of the lighthouse lamp, she heard it. The shape of a truth she could finally touch. Revelation 1. He had come back and left his confession within arm's reach of her forgiveness. Revelation 2. On the very morning she thought she was most alone, he had been there, close enough to put his hand on the rail where hers rested, now close enough to see the curve of her shoulder, and still he had stayed silent. Silence, she realized, is not the absence of love. It's the most frightened way of loving. She folded the letter against her chest and closed her eyes until the beam of the lamp moved through the rain like a slow breath. When she finally stood, she knew where she had to go next. Not backward, not forward, but home, to answer a letter that had been waiting on the third step for 20 years. Part 2. The third step at dawn. Redemption Declaration. Morning arrived shyly, as if it had been listening at the door all night and was embarrassed to be seen. The storm drained into a pale sky. The town's rooftops exhaled steam. The lighthouse blinked more softly, as if forgiven. Amelia laid Ethan's letter on her kitchen table, smoothed the waxed paper over it like a sacrament, and brewed tea she would not drink. Then she pulled a fresh sheet from the drawer, good paper, the kind she had once reserved for him, and began to write. The words came steady, unadorned, as if they had been practicing in the dark for years. Ethan, I found what you left for me. The third step still knows your weight. I think I always did too. You were wrong about being a rumor. You became the distance I learned to measure myself against. I used to think patience was a room I had to stand inside without moving. Now, I know it's a door I can choose to open when I am ready to leave. I forgive the storm. I forgive the tide. I forgive the man who walked past my window because he didn't know how to knock. I forgive the woman who didn't run into the street when she felt the shape of your absence in the air. If this letter arrives too late for anyone but me, let it still be true. I loved you in the language we were brave enough to speak. I will keep living in it, even when I'm quiet. Amelia. She folded the letter and placed it inside an envelope addressed with a care she hadn't allowed herself in decades. To Ethan Hale. Harbor Light. Third step. She walked back to the lighthouse in a light that made everything look newly washed. The path held the memory of last night's fear with the gentleness of a fading bruise. At the door, she paused. Not to hesitate, but to listen. The sea sounded like paper turning. Inside, she climbed to the third step and slid her letter beneath the loose board, facing the open air that had once swallowed their words, and now, finally, could be trusted with them. "I'm answering you," she said aloud to the empty stairs. "Not to call you back, but to let you go the way you came, with light." She stayed a long time. She touched the railing and imagined another hand warmed by the same iron. She pictured the young postman from decades ago, the shuttered shop, the woman with the cardigan, the countless small mercies of strangers who had unknowingly carried her story forward. She thought of the students who had moved away, the couples who had laughed next door, the flowers that had lived and died by her window, a chorus of ordinary witnesses to the most stubborn kind of love. When she finally stepped outside, the day had opened fully. Gulls looped and scolded the tide line. The wind lifted a strand of hair against her cheek. She turned toward the pier. Near the end of the weathered boards, a boy sat with a tackle box and an orange. He glanced up, smiled shyly, as children do when they sense a secret and know better than to ask. Amelia smiled back and kept walking until the boards beneath her feet felt like an old memory. She took from her pocket the second photograph. The empty pier at dawn, her younger self a pale shape at the end. She held it against the rail, aligning picture with present, ghost with woman. The world agreed to match. In that alignment, the second revelation rose quiet and undeniable. The life she had lived while waiting was not an empty hallway. It was a house she had kept with care. Students taught, neighbors greeted, books read aloud to a sea that does not answer but always listens. Her waiting had not been a pause. It had been a path. She put the photograph back in her pocket and closed her eyes. "Here is my answer," she whispered and began to read. Not from his letters this time, but from her own, unfolding the life she had written when no one was there to hear it. She read the names of the flowers she had planted, the titles of the books that had held her during storms, the small kindnesses strangers had given her at the counter of dull afternoons. She read until the wind took her voice and returned it softened. When she was done, she sat with her hands in her lap and let silence do what it does best when invited kindly: hold. Behind her, footsteps creaked along the pier. An elderly man with a thermos stopped a respectful distance away. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she answered. "That lighthouse," he added, nodding toward it. "I saw a fellow wait there once, years ago. Storm like the world was ending. Sat on the steps with a roll of paper in his pocket. Stayed till the lamp went off." Amelia smiled without surprise. "Did he leave anything?" "A letter, I think. Slid it under a board. The keeper found it later and said, 'Some things don't need a mailman.' We all laughed like we knew what it meant. Maybe we did." "Maybe we didn't," she said, and the man chuckled and moved on, whistling a fragile tune that sounded like something from a childhood no one owned anymore. Amelia stood. The sea glittered like 1,000 unopened envelopes. She touched the rail one last time and turned back toward town. As she crossed the sand, the sun slipped free of a cloud and met the lighthouse glass. The beam turned briefly into a sort of white, then softened to a benediction. She felt it touch the side of her face. Not a spotlight, not a judgment, but a hand. She lifted her face into it and spoke to the wind with a certainty that surprised even her. "I forgive you," she told the tide, the years, the letters, the man. "And I forgive myself for believing that love has a deadline." The wind answered by not answering, which had always been its way. Back home, she returned the letters to the table and arranged them by date. Not to reorder the past, but to honor how it had arrived. She placed the photograph of Ethan by the window where the light could find it at afternoon. She framed the lavender. She set an extra cup at the table, not as an invitation to a ghost, but as a reminder that she was no longer eating alone. Before dusk, she wrote one more note and taped it to the inside of her door, where only she would read it when she left each morning. "I am not waiting anymore. I am living in the love that arrived." Then she opened the door and stepped into evening. The sky had the faint pearly color of forgiveness. The town was not different, but she was. a woman who had walked into her own life and found it fully furnished. As she passed the post office, the bell over the door rang for someone else. A young couple came out laughing, a parcel between them. For a second, their joy hit her in the place where old ache lives, and then, miraculously, it became light. She kept walking, her shadow long and gentle across the road, the lighthouse behind her blinking a steady, ordinary grace. In the months that followed, the sea learned her new name. No longer the woman who waited, Amelia Gray became simply Amelia again, a name spoken without ache. The tide no longer carried ghosts, it carried mornings. Her days unfolded in small, sacred rituals. She rose with the light, brewed tea, and opened her window wide enough for the sound of the waves to reach her writing desk. On the table lay Ethan's last letter, framed not as a relic but as part of her living space, the way others might keep a vase of flowers that are always changing but never gone. The townspeople noticed the difference in her. The children who once whispered that the teacher by the sea was lonely now saw her walking through the market, buying fruit, humming softly. The new postman, a boy with the same uncertain eyes as the one from decades before, always smiled when she greeted him. Sometimes he would hand her a blank envelope, addressed to no one, just so she could have the pleasure of receiving something again. She would laugh and promise to fill it with words worth sending. At the lighthouse, her letter remained beneath the third step. She never moved it. Once every few weeks, she climbed the stairs, placed fresh lavender beside it, and sat for a while, listening to the sea hum its endless refrain. She no longer cried there. She simply listened, and sometimes she answered. "I read your light," she would whisper. "It still reaches here." Her writing changed too. No longer love letters to one man, but reflections for everyone who had ever waited for something to return. A parent, a child, a moment, a promise. Her essays began appearing in small journals, then in anthologies about love and time. Readers wrote to her saying her words made them forgive things they thought unforgivable. She never told them the name behind the story. She only signed A.G. and let the rest remain between her and the sea. One evening, she received a letter from a museum in London. They were curating an exhibit titled "The Light Between Us: Lost Correspondences." Among the featured pieces was a photograph of a woman sitting on a pier, reading a letter, Ethan's most famous work. They asked permission to display her story beside it. Amelia smiled. The circle was closing, not with finality, but with grace. She agreed and sent a single line to accompany the photograph. Some letters travel longer than we do, but they still arrive exactly when they're meant to. When the exhibit opened months later, visitors stopped before the photograph in quiet reverence. They did not know the whole story, only that something inside it felt true. Back in Lindsworth, the sea went on with its usual business: tides, gulls, wind, unconcerned with the tenderness it had carried. Amelia grew older as the sea stayed the same. She taught less, wrote more, laughed often. Her house became filled with light, literal and not. One winter morning, she awoke to find frost on her window forming the delicate pattern of letters, looping, half-formed shapes like handwriting made of glass. She touched them with her fingertips, smiling. "Still writing to me, aren't you?" she said softly. That day, she packed a small box, one envelope from Ethan, one of her own letters, and the lavender flower, now pressed perfectly flat, and brought it to the lighthouse. She placed the box on the windowsill of the keeper's room, where the morning light always lingered the longest. Then she sat by the railing, closed her eyes, and let the sound of the waves merge with the rhythm of her breathing. When the keeper found the box later that evening, he left it untouched. Some stories, he knew, didn't need to be moved. They just needed to rest where the light could find them. Years later, when the lighthouse was automated and the building turned into a small museum, the third step remained slightly uneven. Visitors sometimes tripped there, then laughed, never knowing what history hid beneath. And if they leaned close enough, when the wind was calm and the light hit just right. They might hear it, the faint whisper of paper turning, like someone still reading. The sea is quiet now. The letters are home, and somewhere between the crash of waves and the hum of wind, a voice, neither his nor hers, says what both had been trying to say all along. Love doesn't vanish when the words stop. It lingers in the silence that follows, patient, steady, and finally understood.